All right, good morning or good afternoon, or good evening, I guess, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. We've recently switched to our Wednesday at 6 o'clock Mountain time zone, so I'm still adjusting to it. So, welcome to Crazy Talk. If this is your first time joining us, Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show where I interview all sorts of people about all sorts of things related to mental health. I'm your host, Lee Thomas. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for joining us again. I'm really glad we haven't scared you off. I'm really excited for this week's episode. It's someone who I have chatted with for a while, like a while back, and we asked about getting her on the show, and now we finally have her on the show, so I'm really excited. So this week we have Rebecca Lynn. So Rebecca is 27 years old, residing in Windsor, Essex, Ontario. Ever since Rebecca remembers, she has always felt off. She knew that what she was experiencing was more than sadness. She wasn't sure that what she was feeling, and when she was trying to talk to adults she could trust, they often turned a blind eye, leaving her concerns unanswered. During this time, Rebecca resorted to different strategies of self-harm. Her first suicide attempt was at the tender age of 9. In 2014, Rebecca's world was turned upside down when her father made the decision to walk away from their family. This resulted in a downward spiral for Rebecca and her mom. When starting the counseling process, Rebecca was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. The pieces of Rebecca's past finally began to fit together as she continued on her journey of accepting her mental illness and advocating for mental health awareness. Now, Rebecca is the author behind the blog Radiantly Alive, and we will put a link to that blog in the comments below at the end of this show. Rebecca also makes aromatherapy bracelets and essential oil roller bottles to encourage others to find alternative coping strategies. Rebecca, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm really excited to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. It's finally happening.
Yay! I know we reached out a long time ago, and so we finally had an opportunity to get everything together, and I'm just so glad it's finally worked out. So, Rebecca, one of my favorite questions that I like. Oh, sorry, you go.
I was gonna say, when we first started talking about this, I was working 2 jobs. Like, that was almost a year ago.
Oh my goodness, time flies, right? And I was still living in New Brunswick back then.
Yeah.
So one of the questions I like to ask on the show is usually kind of a why question. So lots of people, we know the numbers, like at least 1 in 5 people, but lots of people live with mental health issues. Lots of people live with mental illnesses, but not a lot of people necessarily talk about them or get into mental health advocacy. So why did you? What was the driving force for you to start telling your story and to start writing about it and blogging about it?
For me, because I've experienced it at such a young age, I feel like nobody should have that experience ever. It's probably the worst feeling to have. So often I do work at a daycare. I often talk to my kids about it, see how they're doing, see if they're okay, because I didn't have that adult person in my life. Even when I tried to turn to people, they often turn a blind eye back on me. And I just don't want other people to feel the way that I felt. If I can help change one person's perspective, then that's what I'm here for.
And that's really interesting to me because I work with youth, or as we call them, youth, kind of adolescent, early adults. So I work with kind of, age 11 and 12, kind of up to, well, my age in my early 20s, soon to be mid 20s. And so how do you have those conversations with younger kids? Because when I reach out to, middle schoolers, I can say the word mental illness and people kind of know what I'm talking about. Is that something that you find with like younger kids, that you need to use certain language?
So I do try to use this simple language. So I'll say, how are you feeling? If they say they're feeling okay, I'll ask them, why are you feeling okay? If they say that they're feeling something a little funny in their tummy, I'll ask them why. Why do you have a test today? Are you just getting a little bit of anxiety because you have a project? What can I do to help you? And then they'll say, well, right now I think I really need help with this. And they're pretty good because I work with school-age children. So they're starting to get those signs of what their body is telling them. And I'm just here to kind of help them narrow down the source of it. And sometimes it isn't necessarily like, I think they have a diagnosis or something, but we all feel a little anxious sometimes, and that's okay. There's good stress, and I explain that to them, that you're feeling a good stress because you want to do well on this. And then if it's something that I'm actually really concerned about, then I will talk to their parents.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where like that idea that anxiety is something that affects everyone. I know I've
Mhm.
like run a couple webinars and that sort of thing about it where anxiety is something that impacts everyone, but we have this idea that, we need to be happy all the time, we need to be positive all the time. And if we don't acknowledge the anxious feelings that we're having, how do we address them, right? Like we can't
Exactly.
acknowledge something that we're not willing to, or we can't do anything about something that we're not willing to acknowledge, right?
Exactly.
So in those situations where you are talking to, and like obviously we don't need to get too into specifics here or anything like that, but in those situations where you are talking to a young person's parents, do you find that people are generally responsive to that, or do you find that there's a lot of people saying, not my kid, not like mental health is not something that we talk about? What do you find
Um,
more?
I honestly haven't had to talk to too many like parents about it because I find some of it is just nerves from school. And a lot of parents are really active within their children's lives and they know that they have a test or a big project or something. But the parents that I have spoken to are more open about it than what people were when I was going to school. So I'm 27. When I was going to school, everything was still
Yes.
under the rug. It was still very taboo. Like, you can't feel that way as a child. Children don't feel that way. You must be wrong. And now look, like 4 years ago, it's finally diagnosed, but I've been living with it since I was a child. I don't remember many very happy days because I was feeling this overwhelming sadness that I knew wasn't just sadness.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's really important that you talk about in one of your most recent blog posts on your blog as well talks a lot about the issue of self-harm, and I think that that's still a topic that even now remains pretty kind of taboo. People often don't like to hear about things when it comes to self-harm, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
something that people are like, oh, are you really sure you should be talking about that? Are you really sure you should be saying that? And getting those kind of responses. So with you writing about it, have you found that people have been pretty open and receptive to it, or do you still have people saying like,
I actually get a lot of positive feedback. So I had some people from my youth come back and say, like, hey, I've been experiencing stuff too. It's amazing that you're taking the step to actually talk about it. I also had a friend who is a nutritionist message me saying, hey, I'm so proud that you addressed the fact that self harm isn't just cutting. My self harm was never cutting. My self harm was always other things that you can't necessarily see. You don't know that I'm doing it unless I tell you. And I'm finally at that stage in my life where I can say, I cut my nails short because I scratched myself. I have to hide safety pins because I'm tempted to stick them between my toes. Like, it's just, when I was younger too, we were always told it's just cutting. That's the only thing that you can hurt yourself with. So, as I mentioned in my blog, I used to hit my head against the wall hoping for a concussion so I could miss school. I used to throw rocks at my head again, hoping to miss school out of it because school wasn't a safe zone for me. So, I think that's a really important topic too. Is anything to hurt yourself is self harm. It's not just one thing.
yeah, and I think even like not that it's always interesting to me because there are these narratives, and when we fit into them, it sucks, and when we don't fit into them, it sucks, right?
Yeah,
Like so
yeah,
because I was someone who struggled with like self-harm, but I always was a cutter, right? Like that was
right.
always kind of my go-to
Mm-hmm.
thing. And so fitting into that stereotype, I was like, oh, like I don't feel good about fitting into this stereotype. But then with you not fitting into the stereotype, that also doesn't feel good. And we like I've talked about this when it comes to like eating disorder stuff as well, right? Where I fit a lot of the stereotypes of someone who would have an eating disorder, but and so that feels like, oh, like am I just another number? But then in all the
Yeah,
ways that I don't fit those stereotypes, I feel invalidated, right?
yeah.
So it's like you can't win.
That's exactly it too. And I've had people tell me, like, well, is that really self harm then if you're not doing something so specific to fit into a box? And yes, it is. And the sad part is that I didn't know that until I took child and youth worker. So when I was
Oh
younger and I was
wow.
doing these habits, I had no idea right through high school, right until college. I had no clue that what I was doing wasn't safe for me. To me, it was normal.
Yeah, and those coping mechanisms that we develop, and sometimes it's interesting to me you talking about not learning about it until, post-secondary, because that was a very similar experience to me where like with my eating disorder, because no one talked about what an eating disorder was when I was in high school or middle school. I knew the behaviors that I was engaging in, but I didn't have the word eating disorder to really put to it until kind of when I learned about it in academia, which is
Okay.
really interesting because a lot of people don't necessarily, and like, people make all sorts of decisions in terms of what's best for them in terms of their education, which is great. But if I hadn't, taken that particular course at that particular school, would I have learned that term? And like, where would my life be today had I never learned that term? You know what I mean?
Exactly, exactly. I would probably honestly still think it was normal and probably still partake in it instead of try to break the habit.
Yeah. So when it comes to, because that was like, and same boat, like that was a behavior that you engaged in for a very long time and was, very much a part of kind of your set of coping skills,
Mhm.
whether or not it was a positive coping skill or not. I think, is a whole other
Still coping skill.
conversation,
Yeah.
but it was still a coping skill. So you talked about only being diagnosed in the last 4 years. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, how you learned to develop new coping skills and what that process was like for you?
Sure. So, like I said, in 2014, my dad made the decision rather to walk away from our family. Our family is extremely small. It's just myself and my mom is disabled. So I'm basically her caretaker as well. So we decided together that our family doctor went out of business at the same time. Everything kind of was along the same timeline and it all just kind of really worked out. So my mom said to me, she went to the nurse practitioner's office, which is a nurse ran, but they're also affiliated with a doctor in Essex. So they can diagnose you. It's basically a one stop shop for health. So there are nurses, there is a social worker, there is a chiropractor, all this amazing resources that is also government funded. So since my mom was at the time on welfare and I was working a part time job, I didn't have the funding to even go to counseling. So this really came in the right place at the right time. So my mom checked it out first and she really encouraged me to go and we were going to start counseling with the social worker there. I was a little bit hesitant because I did have this past that at that time I was ashamed of. I wasn't willing to talk about it with anybody. Looking back now, asking for help was the best thing I could have done. So I started counseling. They did the tests on me to see if I had any mental illness, basically, because I told them these feelings that I had. And at first, I was diagnosed with situational depression and generalized anxiety disorder. Then I had to disclose to my social worker that my first suicide attempt was at 9. That's what changed the diagnosis to a major depressive disorder diagnosis. So,
And there's so many different questions I want to share. So, or I want to ask. So, thank you for sharing that with us.
yeah.
Um, and you've talked very openly about your suicide attempt,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly when you were 9. And so, is that something that, because suicide remains a very difficult topic for a lot of people
Yes.
to talk about, right? It's something that a lot of us have personal connections with, whether through our own experience or through the experiences of people that we care about. Um, so I guess my question is, what has driven you to talk so openly about suicide in particular? Because that is a topic where even mental health advocates are
Mm-hmm.
often quite hesitant to talk about it.
I also feel quite hesitant, but I feel almost as if I'm not going to talk about it. That's one less person who's going to bring up this topic. So, my suicide attempt, I honestly didn't think was valid because, as my blog says, it was for Advil. But at 9 years old, I really did think and hope and wish that that would do something, that that would seriously harm me or even make me not see the light of day. Looking back now, I realize that obviously that isn't the case. So that's what I was kind of telling my social worker. And she's like, no, but that's what you're hoping. So that is a valid attempt. So once it was basically clarified that it was valid, the validity of it, I started opening up about it. I started talking about it. Because even those little attempts, one day you practice so much, you're going to get good. And you're going to know exactly what to do. My goal is to just help somebody before they get to that point.
And I think you touched on something really, really important with this idea of validity. There's this common thread in what I hear from a lot of people who live with mental health issues, and I know it's very true of my own experience as well, is this idea that, you know, our experience isn't valid because of whatever reason, right? Like my experience isn't valid because, you know, I was this age, or my experience isn't valid because other people have it worse, or my experience isn't valid because of, you know, whatever reason. So do you have any, I guess, tips or tricks to share in terms of learning to validate your own experiences and learning to say, hey, this is, you know, do other people have it worse? Like, sure, maybe, but that doesn't mean my experience isn't valid.
I just learned that I can't compare to anybody else but myself. I don't own the pen to anybody else's story. I only can own mine. I know my situation. I know my thoughts behind my actions. I know why I did what I did. Just because something isn't valid to somebody else doesn't mean it's not true. It's your true, authentic story. And once you start showing your authentic self, people will accept you for who you are. They will take your message for what it is. Because once you start loving yourself and showing yourself, that message just shines through. Whatever you're saying, everybody will believe you once you start believing in yourself and your story.
Yeah, and that's something that I try to share kind of in my own way when I do presentations at schools and that sort of thing. And I had a student ask me one time, and I thought it was a tough question, so I'm going to ask you. But they were kind of saying, you know, once you started being authentically yourself, and once you started, you know, being honest about your experience and all that sort of thing, did you lose any friends? And that was what they asked me. And I was like, that's a good question because I don't know how to answer that, because it's like, I don't want to say yes, but kind of yes, a little bit, but I gained so many more. You know what I mean? So what was your experience of that?
Actually, extremely similar. So, when I was diagnosed, I had finished one college program and I was going to go into another one. I was going through counseling. So, counselors always encourage you to reach out to people that you trust, because for us to keep everything bottled in is not good. That's what's going to make us do these actions that we know are harmful to ourselves, whether it be a suicide attempt, a self-harm attempt, anything. You need somebody, you need a support group, and that is so, so, so important. I had two friends in college who I thought I could trust with everything, and turns out that they walked out of my life. But what I've learned from it is just that their part in my story is done. Their part in my journey, in my chapter, it's done, and that's okay. Now I have friends who I can confide everything in, and they're here, and maybe one day they're going to leave as well. I mean, people come and go for different reasons. They're going to teach you lessons. They're going to show you different parts of yourself that you didn't necessarily know existed. They're going to teach you something, and they are there for a reason. But when they leave, it's for a reason too. Sometimes it's because their vision changes, they have shifts in themselves, and you no longer fit their story either. So I kind of get both points.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of, I guess almost looking at it from the other lens, which is something I've just been thinking about a lot lately myself, is that like I started, you know, really taking care of myself. There were certain people who left my life for sure, but there was also certain people whose life like I left when I started taking care of myself, because I realized like I wasn't, you know, getting out of the relationship what I needed, or I was, you know, in it for the wrong reasons, or I wasn't setting healthy boundaries, or whatever it might have been, right? And so it's definitely, I think sometimes those friend breakups. I don't know what to call them. You know what I mean? Like those like friend
Yeah.
breakups friendships are very important relationships in our lives. So sometimes I guess it comes back to that idea of validating. Sometimes we feel invalid being really, torn up over losing a friend because we're told, it's not as if they were family or it's not as if it was a romantic relationship or that sort of thing. But our friends are such important relationships in our lives, and it's okay to like mourn that loss, right?
Absolutely. I still struggle with the two girls I don't talk to anymore. Like, it's still very difficult to see them. Like, I'm happy for them that they're living their best lives, but it's difficult because I used to be right there with them. I used to be a part of that, and now
Mm-hmm.
I'm not. And I'm kind of on this other journey to self enlightenment and self fulfillment that honestly, they just don't fit anymore. And I'm coming to terms that that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And so on this, you've talked about kind of this journey to self-fulfillment and self-enlightenment. And I'd say, everyone, has a lot of work to do on that. But what has been the most important thing, do you think, that you've learned along that journey so far?
For me, it's definitely making the good habits. So I make a habit that I have a gratitude journal where I write 3 to 5 things I'm grateful for every day, just to find those small things. Because sometimes we have such a bad day that it can be so overwhelming. But if you just see those small things, it kind of makes the day shift, and you can kind of shift your focal lens to focus on the positive rather than the burdens that was weighing you down.
Yeah, and that's something that like I'm a big fan of Brene Brown's work. For people who have watched several episodes of Crazy Talk, they've definitely heard me talk about Brene Brown before. Um, and that's one of the things that she talks about is that she calls them, wholehearted people. And she says that like she was looking into what do wholehearted people have in common. And one of them was like a practice of gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, how that's very different from the quote unquote an attitude of gratitude. It's not just about what your attitude is, it's about physically or like, habitually what do you practice, right? So I think that that's an amazing thing to get into and an amazing piece of advice for anyone who might be watching and might be struggling. So for the folks who are watching and going like, wow, Rebecca is absolutely amazing. Like, I definitely want to read this blog. I want to find out more about what she's up to. What would you like folks to do next who are tuning in?
If anything, just give the blog a look, a read, a comment, anything like that helps me out. I am in the process of upgrading the blog so that I will be definitely the owner and it will no longer be a WordPress blog, but it will be my own, which is super, super exciting. I'm everywhere on social media. I have Facebook, Instagram, everything is also linked right through the blog.
Okay, awesome. So if people go to the blog, and again, we'll put a link to the blog in the comments below, but if people go to the blog, then they are
Access to
connected
everything.
in terms of how
Yes.
they get in touch with you. Okay, that's amazing. So Rebecca, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been an absolute joy having you on. It's been great having this conversation and just
Yes.
a really genuine conversation from the heart, which is really amazing.
It
So thank
was.
you so
Tell
much
about
for
that
being on the
authentic
show.
self. Thank you
That
for
authentic
having me.
self. Yeah, we're living it.
Yes.
So for those of you who are watching the show and going, Crazy Talk is awesome. I would love to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. You can do that by signing up for my mailing list. You can sign up for my mailing list at leethomas.ca. You can also sign up for my mailing list by clicking on the link that is going to be in the comments below in a moment or two. I do want to thank everyone who tuned in. I know we've had viewers coming and going. And so thanks for everyone who's left comments. Robbie Weatherby, thank you for the heart, which I'm sure was for Rebecca. And thank you so much for that. And if you're watching this on the replay, if you're watching this because you got an email in your inbox from leethomas.ca, be sure to share this video with someone who you think might need it, someone who you think might need to hear our conversation, someone who you think might need to read Rebecca's blog. Please do that. Other than that, be sure to tune in next week, Wednesday at 6 o'clock. We are a new time, but still same old us. And other than that, have a great rest of your week, everyone. Take care, guys. Bye.